In the kaleidoscopic chaos of the 1970s, animation underwent a quiet revolution. The bright, hand-drawn innocence of Disney's golden age was fading, replaced by a new wave of filmmakers who saw animation as a weapon, a medium for rebellion, satire, and taboo storytelling. It was the decade when animators stopped asking permission and started breaking rules. The result? Some of the most daring, disturbing, and controversial animated movies ever created. Films so provocative that governments banned them. Theaters refused to screen them, and parents protested outside cinemas. Many of these movies are barely whispered about today, locked away in dusty vaults or circulating in grainy bootlegs among collectors. Yet their legacies shaped the boundaries of animation forever. From hallucinatory experiments dripping in psychedelia to blistering political allegories that enraged censors, these banned films stand as relics of a countercultural movement that dared to confront war, religion, and sex at a time when animation was still seen as for kids. If you're new here, welcome to Vintiverse, the place where we rediscover forgotten films, banned treasures, and lost cultural moments you were never meant to see. And if you've been here before, you know what's coming. Buckle up, because some of these titles will make you question everything you thought you knew about 1970s animation. Number 15. Heavy Traffic, produced in 1973. When Ralph Bakshi released Heavy Traffic in 1973, it felt like someone had dropped a bomb on the polite world of animated films. This was no Saturday morning cartoon. This was a grimy, street-level portrait of urban decay, sex, and survival in New York City. Bakshi, already infamous for pushing boundaries with Fritz the Cat, doubled down on raw realism here, blending rotoscoped live action with surreal animation to depict a young cartoonist navigating a world of mobsters, poverty, and racial tension. The film's gritty depiction of interracial relationships, prostitution, and violence shocked audiences and censors alike. Unlike Disney's sanitized fantasies, Heavy Traffic reveled in discomfort, a mirror held up to a crumbling 1970s America, still reeling from Vietnam and racial unrest. Its characters were flawed, desperate, and vividly human, a stark contrast to the talking animals and fairy tale princes dominating animation up to that point. Censorship boards pounced immediately. Heavy Traffic was slapped with an X rating, effectively banning it from mainstream theaters. In some states, it never screened at all. In others, it was relegated to midnight showings in adult cinemas, lumped alongside exploitation films, despite its artistry. Number 14. Belladonna of Sadness, produced in 1973. Few animated films in history carry the haunting beauty and raw sensuality of Belladonna of Sadness. Directed by Osamu Tezuka's protege, Eiichi Yamamoto, this Japanese masterpiece was the third and final installment of the experimental Anime-Rama trilogy, and it pushed boundaries far beyond anything Western audiences were prepared to see in 1973. Inspired loosely by Jules Michelet's book, La Sorcière, the film tells the story of Jeanne, a peasant woman brutally assaulted on her wedding night, who makes a fateful pact with the devil, transforming her suffering into a harrowing journey of vengeance, mysticism, and erotic liberation. Stylistically, Belladonna of Sadness was unlike anything else at the time. Its watercolored paintings bleed into one another in slow pans, creating the sensation of flipping through a cursed storybook. The imagery was overtly sexual and hypnotically surreal, an intentional artistic choice that mirrored Jeanne's descent into power and madness. But in conservative 1970s Japan, this was incendiary. Religious groups and censorship boards recoiled at its graphic depictions of sexual violence and its sympathetic portrayal of witchcraft, seeing it as both morally corrupt and spiritually dangerous. The controversy was so intense that Belladonna of Sadness was effectively buried upon release. Japanese theaters hesitated to screen it, Western distributors refused to touch it, and for decades, it languished languished in obscurity. It wasn't until a 4K restoration in 2016 that the film was reintroduced to the world, earning belated recognition as a feminist allegory and a masterpiece of avant-garde animation. Today, it stands as one of the most infamous banned films of the 1970s, a cautionary tale of how art can be too bold, too provocative for its own time.
Number 13. Fantastic Planet, produced in 1973. When René Lelouch's Fantastic Planet first appeared, audiences didn't quite know what they were looking at. The cutout animation style, with paper-like characters moving through eerie alien landscapes, was unlike anything in mainstream animation. Based on Stéphane Woull's novel Ums and Série, the film tells the story of Ums, tiny human-like beings enslaved by the towering drags, blue-skinned aliens who view them as nothing more than pests. The premise may have been science fiction, but its allegory was razor-sharp, a critique of colonialism, racism, and the dehumanizing systems of oppression that defined much of human history. Released during the height of Cold War paranoia and anti-establishment counterculture, Fantastic Planet struck nerves in every direction. To some, it was a veiled indictment of Soviet oppression. To others, an allegory for Western imperialism. In either interpretation, it challenged the status quo, and governments noticed. Eastern Bloc countries, fearing its subversive message, banned it outright, while in France and the United States, it earned an adult-only reputation, screened at midnight festivals rather than mainstream cinemas. Number 12. Coonskin, produced in 1975. Ralph Bakshi was no stranger to controversy. By the mid-1970s, his name was synonymous with adult animation. After Fritz the Cat and Heavy Traffic had already scandalized critics and thrilled counterculture audiences, Bakshi turned his attention to America's most radioactive subject, race. The result was Coonskin, an audacious blend of live action and animation that detonated like a cultural bomb. At its core, Coonskin is a modernized retelling of African-American folktales, following Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear, and Preacher Fox as they navigate the gritty underworld of Harlem. Through their journey, Bakshi confronts every racial stereotype that had poisoned American media for decades, not to glorify them, but to expose their absurdity and the racism underlying them. It was satire at its sharpest, but in 1975, nuance often got lost in the noise. Before the film even hit theaters, controversy erupted. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, led protests, claiming the film reinforced harmful caricatures rather than critiquing them. In New York, demonstrators picketed outside Paramount's offices, chanting and holding signs that accused Bakshi of racism. One protest turned chaotic, with scuffles breaking out between protesters and fans, defending the film's artistic intent. The media seized on the uproar, painting Coonskin as either a bold anti-racist statement or an unforgivable act of exploitation. Censorship followed swiftly. Several theaters pulled the film from their schedules after receiving threats of vandalism and boycotts. Distributors hesitated to promote it, fearing backlash that could damage their reputations. In some southern states, local boards banned it outright, labeling it racially inflammatory and unfit for public viewing. Number 11. 1001 Nights, produced in 1974. By the mid-1970s, Osamu Tezuka was already a legend in Japan, celebrated as the god of manga and the creator of Astro Boy and Kimba the White Lion. But audiences who knew him for wholesome, family-friendly storytelling were unprepared for what he unleashed in 1001 Nights. This wasn't a straightforward retelling of the beloved Arabian folktales. It was an experimental, erotic, and deeply satirical reimagining that shocked censors and delighted counterculture audiences. The film follows Aladdin, a wandering adventurer whose journey through palaces, deserts, and magical realms is punctuated by hallucinatory imagery, sensuality, and surreal humor. Tezuka didn't shy away from mature themes, exploring greed, lust, and moral corruption in ways that clashed with the sanitized depictions of fairy tales Western audiences were used to. His art style, already iconic for its clean lines and expressive characters, took a psychedelic turn here,
swirling colors, kaleidoscopic transformations, and dreamlike sequences that mirrored the chaotic cultural energy of the 1970s. Censorship was swift and global. In conservative regions of Japan, the film was restricted to adult-only screenings, its erotic content sparking outrage from family groups and religious organizations. International distributors, particularly in Europe and the United States, deemed it too risque for mainstream audiences. Many theaters refused to screen it altogether, and some countries placed outright bans on the film, citing its graphic and moral corrupt content. The title's association with a famous folktale only fueled the backlash. Parents expecting an adventure story instead found a bold critique of human vice.
Number 10. The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, produced in 1974. When The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat hit theaters, it carried the weight of a notorious legacy. Rolf Bakshi's original Fritz the Cat had already made history 2 years earlier as the first X-rated animated feature, an underground sensation that shocked Hollywood and mainstream audiences alike. But this sequel, produced in 1974, was different. Bakshi had walked away from the project, frustrated with the studio's creative direction. Without its original visionary, The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat became something stranger, darker, and far more chaotic. The film abandons a linear narrative in favor of a surreal anthology structure. Fritz, now a cynical and disillusioned husband, escapes his mundane reality through wild daydreams. In one life, he's a soldier slogging through Vietnam. In another, he's embroiled in Nazi Germany. In yet another, he's thrust into a psychedelic future in outer space. Each segment skewers the politics and cultural anxieties of the era, from Cold War paranoia to generational disillusionment, with a mix of crude humor and biting social commentary. Censorship followed quickly. While the original Fritz had already scandalized audiences with its explicit sexual content and racial satire, the sequel leaned even harder into shock value. Critics decried its unrelenting vulgarity. Censors in Europe, Australia, and even parts of the United States banned or heavily restricted it, labeling it morally bankrupt and without redeeming artistic merit. Number 9. Watershed Down, produced in 1978. Few animated films have left audiences as stunned or as emotionally scarred as Watershed Down, produced in 1978. Adapted from Richard Adams' best-selling novel, the film presents itself as a simple tale of rabbits fleeing their doomed warren in search of safety. But beneath its pastoral landscapes and delicate watercolor style lies one of the most brutal depictions of survival ever committed to animation. Unlike the talking animals of Disney films, these rabbits inhabit a harsh, unforgiving world. Their journey is marred by violence, starvation, and tyranny, most memorably in the chilling scenes involving General Woundwart's totalitarian warren. Bloodied battles, suffocating snares, and death scenes rendered in stark realism shattered the assumption that animated animals must always be cute or comforting. Children who stumbled into theaters expecting another Bambi were instead confronted with a meditation on mortality, nature's cruelty, and the thin line between freedom and oppression. The backlash was immediate and intense. In the UK, parents flooded theaters and broadcasters with complaints after children were traumatized by TV airings during Easter holidays. Several European countries, notably in Scandinavia, briefly banned or restricted the film, citing graphic animal cruelty and its emotional impact on young audiences. Even in the United States, where it wasn't formally banned, Watershed Down earned a notorious reputation, whispered about as the cartoon that ruined childhoods. But for all the outrage, Watershed Down earned critical acclaim for refusing to talk down to its audience. It treated children and adults with rare respect, trusting them to grapple with themes of death, leadership, and moral sacrifice. Today, the film is considered a landmark of animated cinema, a daring fusion of literary depth and visual poetry that challenged the very notion of what family entertainment could be. Number 8. Persepolis, prototype, produced in 1979. Long before Persepolis became the celebrated graphic novel and 2007 animated feature we know today, its origins were quietly taking shape in the late 1970s. The prototype animations, produced in 1979 by a young Marjan Satrapi in exile, were raw sketches,
black and white storyboards brought to life through simple movement, narrating her childhood during the Iranian Islamic Revolution. At a time when Western audiences associated animation with escapism, Satrapi used the medium for stark autobiography and political testimony. These prototypes were never meant for wide release. They circulated privately among expatriate Iranian artists and select European animation festivals, where they shocked viewers with their unflinching honesty. Through sparse visuals, veiled women, public executions, whispered rebellions in shadowed hallways, Satrapi captured the suffocating fear of growing up under a newly theocratic regime. For Iranian authorities, this was incendiary, art that openly challenged the sanctity of the revolution and exposed the human cost of its rise to power. The response from the Iranian government was swift and absolute. The prototypes were banned as anti-Islamic propaganda and foreign subversion, and Satrapi herself was effectively blacklisted from ever returning home safely. Even decades later, when Persepolis was finally completed and premiered internationally, the film faced renewed bans in Iran, Lebanon, and other conservative regions, proving that its themes of personal freedom and political dissent remained threatening long after the 1970s.
Number 7. Allegro non troppo, produced in 1976. When Italian animator Bruno Bazzetto released Allegro non troppo in 1976, many dismissed it as a quirky parody of Disney's Fantasia. But beneath its humor and classical soundtrack lay one of the sharpest pieces of social and religious satire the animation world had ever seen. Where Disney's 1940 masterpiece celebrated innocence and wonder, Bazzetto's film used the same musical approach to explore human greed, lust, and self-destruction, themes rarely touched by animation at the time. Structured as an anthology, the film pairs iconic orchestral works, Ravel's Bolero, Debussy's Prélude to l'après-midi d'un faune, with surreal animated segments that critique everything from environmental devastation to sexual repression. One segment shows life evolving from amoeba to humanity in a bittersweet crescendo, while another lampoons Adam and Eve's fall from grace in irreverent, risque fashion. The tone veers from playful to profoundly melancholy, inviting audiences to laugh and reflect in equal measure. This boldness, however, came at a cost. In Catholic-majority Italy, Allegro non troppo's playful jabs at biblical narratives and overt sensuality triggered backlash from religious authorities. The Italian Catholic Church condemned it as mocking secret truths, and several local councils refused to screen it. Internationally, the film struggled to find distributors willing to handle its adult themes. In the United States, it was relegated to art house theaters and late-night festival circuits, bypassing mainstream release entirely. In more conservative regions of Europe and South America, entire segments were cut or banned outright for their nudity and irreverence toward faith. Number 6. Wizards, produced in 1977. By the time Ralph Bakshi produced Wizards in 1977, he had already earned a reputation as animation's most controversial provocateur. But this time, instead of gritty urban realism, he turned to epic fantasy. Though his version of fantasy was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. Wizards blended magic, post-apocalyptic landscapes, and an unmistakably political allegory about fascism, propaganda, and nuclear annihilation. Set thousands of years after a nuclear war, the film tells the story of two brothers, Avatar, a benevolent wizard representing magic and peace, and Black Wolf, a tyrant who discovers ancient Nazi propaganda to rally his mutant armies. Bakshi's audacity lay in directly incorporating archival footage of Hitler speeches and Nazi rallies into an animated feature, a move unprecedented in Western animation. This fusion of high fantasy with real historical atrocity made the film both visionary and deeply unsettling. Censorship was swift and divided along geopolitical lines. In West Germany, where law strictly controlled the use of Nazi imagery, Wizards faced outright bans and restricted screenings for years. Eastern European countries, sensitive to anti-fascist messaging but wary of Western subtext, also blocked its release. Even in the United States, while the film avoided formal banning, many theaters refused to program it due to complaints about its disturbing imagery and unsuitable content for younger viewers, especially as some parents mistakenly assumed it was family-friendly due to its animated format. Number 5. Animal Farm, Soviet adaptation produced in 1974.
Most people know Animal Farm through George Orwell's novel, or the 1954 British animated adaptation funded quietly by the CIA. But few realize that in 1974, the Soviet Union produced its own version, an audacious propaganda counter to Orwell's anti-communist message. This forgotten animated feature inverted the allegory entirely. Rather than critiquing Stalinism, it recast the story as a condemnation of Western capitalism and imperialist greed. Produced by Soyuz Multfilm, the Soviet Union's leading animation studio, this version depicted the pigs not as corrupt dictators, but as liberators overthrowing exploitative human farmers modeled after capitalist archetypes. The message was clear and unapologetically political: communism as salvation, capitalism as tyranny. The animation itself was striking, fluid, painterly, and surprisingly dark, using muted tones and stark imagery that mirrored Soviet art styles of the era rather than the colorful Disney-like visuals Western audiences expected. In the West, the reaction was immediate and hostile. The film was banned outright in the United States, the United Kingdom, and most NATO countries, where it was deemed blatant Cold War propaganda. Even attempts to import it for academic screenings were blocked or heavily censored. In Eastern European nations, meanwhile, the film was celebrated and widely distributed, doubling as both entertainment and ideological indoctrination for young audiences.
Number 4. Fritz the Cat, produced in 1972. When Fritz the Cat premiered in 1972, it shattered every preconceived notion of what an animated film could be. Directed by Rolf Bakshi and adapted from Robert Crumb's infamous underground comic, it was the first animated feature ever to receive an X rating from the Motion Picture Association of America, a label synonymous with hardcore adult content. The shockwaves reverberated instantly. Animation, long seen as a domain of children, suddenly had a new reputation. It could be subversive, sexual, and politically explosive. The film follows Fritz, a hedonistic, self-absorbed cat navigating 1960s counterculture America. His adventures, or misadventures, lead him through college protest, racial tensions, sexual escapades, and drug-fueled chaos. Bakshi's adaptation preserved Crumb's cynical edge, but amplified it for cinema. Racial caricatures, police brutality, and explicit satire of political radicalism collided in ways mainstream audiences had never witnessed in animated form. Censorship boards across the globe erupted. The United Kingdom banned the film outright, labeling it morally reprehensible. Australia joined in, with multiple states refusing to classify the film at all, effectively blocking screenings. Even in the United States, the X rating restricted distribution, forcing Fritz into underground theaters and midnight movie circuits rather than conventional cinemas. Religious groups staged protests, picketing outside theaters and calling the film animated pornography. Politicians decried it as a sign of cultural decay, while film critics argued over whether it was daring social commentary or cheap exploitation. Ironically, the outrage only fueled its popularity. Fritz the Cat became a box office success, the highest grossing independent animated film of its time, and launched Bakshi's career as the enfant terrible of animation. Number 3. The Adventures of Mark Twain, prototype scenes produced in 1979. Will Vinton, often called the pioneer of claymation, was already making waves with his stop-motion innovations in the late 1970s when he began early work on what would become The Adventures of Mark Twain. Long before its full release in 1985, prototype scenes were produced in 1979 and quietly screened in experimental film circuit. Among these early tests was a sequence so unsettling that it instantly sparked controversy, the now infamous Mysterious Stranger segment. In this scene, Twain's characters encounter a figure identifying himself as Satan. Unlike traditional portrayals of the devil as overtly menacing, Vinton's Satan appears calm, almost childlike, inviting the protagonist to create a miniature clay society. Within moments, he casually destroys it, explaining humanity's inherent cruelty and futility. The sequence's eerie tone, quiet,
philosophical and chilling, was far removed from the slapstick or whimsical animation audiences associated with stop motion. Religious groups in conservative parts of the United States responded with outrage, labeling the scene blasphemous for its depiction of Satan as sympathetic and its bleak commentary on human morality. Several test screenings were canceled after church-led protests, and regional censors in parts of the American South banned further exhibition of the prototypes entirely. Even in secular circles, the nihilistic tone unnerved viewers, prompting debates over whether animation should explore such existential themes. Number 2. Dirty Duck. Produced in 1974. If Ralph Bakshi's Fritz the Cat cracked open the door for adult animation, Dirty Duck kicked it off its hinges. Produced in 1974 by Steve Krantz, the same producer behind Fritz, this film was conceived as an unapologetically raunchy follow-up designed to capitalize on the growing underground appetite for X-rated cartoons. But where Fritz blended social commentary with provocation, Dirty Duck gleefully abandoned any pretense of subtlety. The story follows Willard Eisenbaum, a lonely insurance clerk whose mundane existence is upended by the arrival of a crude, foul-mouthed duck known simply as Dirty Duck, who drags him into a chaotic series of sexual misadventures. The narrative is episodic and anarchic, a string of encounters that parody religion, politics, and social taboos with relentless vulgarity. The animation style itself was crude and hastily produced, amplifying its grimy and rebellious aesthetic, a stark contrast to the polished scene of mainstream animated features. Censorship was immediate and global. In the United States, several states refused to certify the film, effectively banning it from theatrical release. European countries, already wary after the Fritz controversies, blocked it outright. The United Kingdom, Australia, and West Germany all prohibited screenings. Critics savaged the film as pornographic garbage, arguing that its shock value lacked the underlying social critique that gave Bakshi's films their bite. Even some underground animation fans felt Dirty Duck went too far, prioritizing obscenity over storytelling.
Number 1. Fantastic Animation Festival. Produced in 1977. Unlike the other entries on this list, Fantastic Animation Festival wasn't a single story. It was a curated anthology. Produced in 1977, this groundbreaking collection gathered some of the most experimental, shocking, and controversial animated shorts from around the world. The result was a kaleidoscopic showcase of what the medium could do when freed from the constraints of mainstream studios and censorship boards. The festival included work from independent animators who pushed the boundaries of style and content, psychedelic visual experiments, anti-war allegories, erotic parodies, and surreal comedies that defied classification. Many of the shorts had previously been banned or heavily censored when released individually, but here they were presented together, amplifying their collective impact. For audiences accustomed to Saturday morning cartoons, the festival's provocative content felt almost alien. Sexuality rendered in abstract forms, violent political satire, and hallucinatory imagery that mirrored the counterculture's fascination with altered states of consciousness. Censors and conservative groups recoiled almost instantly. Because the anthology featured so many banned works under one roof, protests erupted at screenings across North America and Europe. In certain US states, local boards demanded cuts. In others, entire screenings were shut down. Religious leaders condemned the festival as a corruption of youth, while critics were divided, some lauding its innovation, others dismissing it as a freak show of animated excess. Despite the controversy, the festival struck a chord with artists, students, and cinephiles hungry for something different. It toured universities and art houses, inspiring a generation of animators to break free from commercial formulas. Over the years, Fantastic Animation Festival has become a cult relic, remembered less as a single film and more as a movement. Proof that in the 1970s, animation wasn't just evolving, it was rebelling. If this deep dive into banned 1970s animation lit up your curiosity, don't stop here. Vintaverse is full of hidden cinematic treasures waiting to be rediscovered. Hit subscribe and join the community that celebrates the forgotten, the controversial, and the bold.